Delighted to introduce you to transgender activist Abby Stein. Abby is the first openly transgender woman to be raised in an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jewish community, and you can ask her a question in the box below. Abby, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I know that you have a very long and complex story, but if you could just sort of describe to me the community you grew up in, realizing that perhaps the gender you'd been assigned at birth was not the right one for you, and sort of what you did and how you got to be on this sofa today.
Okay. So you just asked me to say something that requires a few hours in 5
Just
minutes.
maybe distill it
So
down
I'm going
as
to
much as you
try.
can.
Okay. So defining the Hasidic community, what I usually use is think about pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about movies, TVs, music, magazines, literature, anything that you identify as part of who we are in our lives doesn't exist there. You're talking about a community that has successfully fought the TV and radio in the 60s. There's no access to internet. They don't speak the language. They don't even speak English. Most people in the community speak Yiddish. They still dress in 18th century dress code, pretty much. Man and woman don't interact with each other at all. It's as far as I know, the most gender segregated society in the United States. So you're talking about, you grew up in a bubble. You grew up in a bubble. I personally grew up in New York City, but I didn't. I grew up geographically here, but culturally, it was, I don't know. I call it a pretend 18th century Eastern Europe. So that's kind of the community. In addition to that, my family is part of a rabbinic dynasty. So the Hasidic community has been, for the last 200 years, pretty much ruled by monarchs in every sense of the word, where there's the same few families who are all related to each other by now because they all marry each other, who have been ruling the community, and it goes from father to son and so on. And while it might not make any sense that because your great-great-grandfather, 150 years ago was a charismatic leader, doesn't mean that you are, but that's how it works. And these rabbis are not just rabbis, they are supreme leaders. They control everything in the community, from people's personal life, communal life, political, financial, and so on. And so both of my parents come from families like that, so that kind of added a lot of, I'd say, a whole other layer of restriction. So that's where I grew up. I have 12 siblings. I have 5 older sisters, 4 younger brothers, and then 3 more sisters. 8 and a half are married by now, meaning one of them's engaged. And yeah, so that's how I grew up. In terms of gender, interestingly enough, I know you asked of like when I realized that the gender of assigned at birth wasn't right. Mm-hmm. To me, it was a lot more, everyone tells me that I'm a boy, but that doesn't feel right. Like there was never a time when I went with it and then decided, oh, that doesn't feel right. Since I remember myself, it was like, I'm a girl, right? But no, everyone says something else. Mm-hmm. So growing up, I had to find different ways of dealing with it. It wasn't something that I could ever talk about. Yeah. LGBT people of any form don't exist in that community. I didn't even know that gay people exist until around 2008, I believe it was, when gay marriage started becoming an issue in New York City, and there were a few people on the fringe of the community that were fighting it. Right. Most people still ignored it, even in the community, and they have a strong political pull because they have a black vote. They still ignored it, didn't want to engage with it. I didn't know trans people exist until I got onto the internet for the first time when I was 20 in 2011, December of 2011. Mm-hmm. So that was, it was a hard experience growing up and not having any outlet, not having any way to express myself. Finally, when I was around 12, I decided that I know what I feel gender-wise, but that's impossible because I'm the only one that feels like that. There's no other person in the world like me. So I started exploring religion, asking questions that I wasn't supposed to ask. I got kicked out of class when I was 12 for asking a question that my teacher didn't like, and my teacher told me at that point that if you're going to continue to ask questions like that, you're going to end up going off the derech. Off the derech is slang for going off the path, which means you're going to believe in the community, which is one of the worst things you can tell a teenager. You're going to leave. It's like, oh my God. Mm. So I slowly progressed with that. Finally, as I mentioned in 2011, I did this horrible thing, and I went on the internet, which is really terrible because the information that you can find there, God forbid.
And how did you find the internet? Did you have to sort of secretly do it?
So interestingly enough, I only knew the internet existed because the community was fighting it.
Right.
So I knew that there's this terrible thing, which I didn't really know how to quantify. I knew that it's something related to computers. Like, computers are okay. We would have computers if they're not connected to the internet. So I knew there's something like the internet. There's something called Wi-Fi, And I even knew the details of how it works because once the community realized that they can't just go and ban the internet because people need it for business, they started going into details of how you have to filter it. They started organizations to filter and what you can and can't have. So I kind of knew exactly how it works because of that. And I had a friend who had a tablet that had a Wi-Fi connection, but it was never connected to Wi-Fi. By the time I got to a point where I can't anymore, it was like the gender part was getting really hard. It was around the time my son was born. So gender was really like kind of punching me in the face at that point. It was really hard to deal with.
And just to clarify for our Facebook audience, so you got married when you were 18.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I got engaged when I was 17, got married when I was 18, and my son was born when I was 19.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this entire time, and that was something that was just the norm in your community.
That is
that was absolutely,
everyone does that. If you're 20 and you're not married, you're really old.
You're over the hill.
Yeah.
So, and how were you feeling at that point? I mean, I can't imagine, you know, on your wedding day, what was that like? Were you kind of disassociating almost from the feelings you had, I guess, had your whole life? I mean, I just wonder what you were feeling.
So there was a few parts. I would say a lot of it was totally, I was like almost trained to ignore them and to suppress all my feelings. And the second you were born, you're born in that community, you grow up, the final point is you're going to get married and have kids. That's the punchline. So you don't really, it's not even something that you think about, like, do you want to get married? That's not even a conversation you ever have. Personally, at that point, I was very into Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, which I think was kind of almost like wheat or something a lot stronger than that, where I was like on this high of like floating around. And for 4 years, it was like, it was what kept me religious for 4 years. So I was on that, and that's also why when I got married, and for those who know anything about Jewish mysticism, know that it gets very graphic when it comes to two people getting together. It's all about the cosmics having sex to some extent. So I was a bit on the dad, a bit suppressed, but I do remember having some thoughts of like, what am I doing? Or I'm on the wrong side of the mechitza, which is like the barrier between the man and woman. But I went with it. There wasn't such a thing as a choice or options, anything like that.
So you discover the internet. At this point, you're married. You have your son. And what happened to? It meant that you left the community. At what point did you discover the internet, and then when did you leave?
It was a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
To some extent, leaving the community was even harder than transitioning, like coming out of trans, because I had no idea what I'm getting into. I didn't know anyone, couldn't speak the language, didn't have an education. I didn't know how to dress. I didn't know how to talk. I remember the first time walking into a Starbucks, and I was just thinking about it. I was at Starbucks across the street here, and I was like, I remember the first time I walked in, I was like, okay, what's happening here? The culture shock is just in every level, in every way. It's the director of Footsteps, which is Footsteps is an organization in New York City that works with people who have left the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community. And she always says that it's like being an immigrant in your own country, which is true because you're an immigrant in every sense of the word. You don't know anything about the culture and how to interact with anyone, but you're in your own country. So even the support that some immigrants will get, we don't even have that. So that was a really hard process. And it took me a long time. As I mentioned, the first time I was intern was December of 2011. I joined Footsteps, this organization, in May of 2012, so it's just over 5 years by now. I got separated from my wife in the spring of 2013, divorced in the summer, just a few months after that. And I guess I could say that was like when I pretty much left. I still lived in Williamsburg with my parents for another year while I had a job working for a packaging company, online sales for a packaging company in East Williamsburg. And then I also started working on my high school diploma. I got my high school diploma in December of 2013. I did a semester of college prep classes during
and this is all in English?
Yeah, at that point it was already in English. So
Which
I
was
started,
a language that you had barely spoken.
Yeah, I started studying English 5 years ago. Yeah.
Right.
So I did a few different ways. I did some online classes. I watched a lot of YouTube videos of English classes for Israelis because I did speak Hebrew, so that was really helpful. I took some classes at BOCES, which is at Rockland Community College in upstate where I lived at that point, so they have high school equivalency classes. I did some programs with an organization here in New York City called Option Center that helps a bit. Footsteps helped me a lot with a tutor and so on. And finally, I applied to colleges during the spring and summer of 2014, and I applied mainly to community colleges and to 4-year public colleges. And then I had a friend of mine who was at NYU, and he told me, no, go ahead, I should apply to NYU. And I took the gamble, I applied to NYU. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to try also Columbia. And I was convinced that I'm not going to get into any of them. I ended up getting into both. And I started school at Columbia in the fall of 2014.
So you went from somebody who was living in a completely remote community, albeit in the middle of the city, didn't speak English. And how many years later from the point you leave do you get into Columbia?
I guess was under 3 years. About.
Pretty extraordinary achievement, huh? Okay, so we've got questions flooding in.
Okay.
Marlene says that she's so glad this conversation is getting the attention it deserves.
Thank you.
And we have a question here from Marie. Did you have any issues with your beliefs or inner demons to deal with?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to address the inner demons. That's too much. And I've done Kabbalah. I've done mysticism. We speak a lot about demons, but leaving this aside for a moment. But beliefs, yeah. So as I mentioned, when I was 12, I started asking questions. By the time I left the community, I didn't leave just because of my gender identity. And actually, I didn't leave because of my gender identity at all. I left because I got to a point that I really didn't believe in anything that community had to offer, which was triggered. The reason, asking questions was triggered by a gender identity, because otherwise, I think it would have taken me a lot more years to start asking questions, because we don't ask questions. You don't question the origins of the Bible. You don't question what our rabbis are saying. Everything is holy. So that definitely what pushed me to question, but I definitely went through a lot of struggles. When I left, I was very done kind of with any religion, with Judaism. I was at that point a practicing atheist, so to speak. Later, I started slowly more exploring different forms of Judaism and interfaith religions, humanistic cultures, and so on. So I started getting involved more with, I'd say, a spiritual and cultural Jewish life, but I'm still not religious in any way. Okay, and we have another question here from Facebook. What's your message to other transgender people growing up in ultra-conservative communities? So this is actually something that I've been working a lot on the last month. I'm actually now in the final stages of putting together a group that would be a support group for people who grew up in fundamentalist religious communities, trans people who grew up in fundamentalist religious communities. Mm-hmm. We already have a support group, a Facebook group, and an in-person group for people who grew up in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. But I want to expand it now to general communities, and I've already interacted one-on-one with a lot of people. I interacted last week with someone who grew up Amish, people who grew up in Mormon, some people who grew up fundamentalist Muslim in the Middle East. I've dealt with some people who grew up Jehovah's Witnesses and so on. It's all fundamentalist religious communities where LGBT issues is something that's not discussed, not just hated. We are talking here not just about communities that have anti-LGBT sentiments, but rather communities where this is evil and this is something that's barely discussed. So it has been something that I've been working on. And I think the biggest message that I can say is just saying that it's possible. And at the same time being aware that it's hard. I'm going to lie if I'm going to say that it's all, I always joke, I would lie if I say it's all rainbows and unicorns. It is all rainbows, but unicorns are not always here. So it's hard, but it's possible. And there's communities out there. Thankfully, we are at a time where I think every major city in the U.S. has an LGBT support group, even in the Deep South. You could find support. It's important to find support. And most importantly, to know that, no, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not going to hell. God, whatever that means, doesn't hate you. And you can do it. It doesn't matter what your family or community is telling you. It's possible.
Abby, I could talk to you all day, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Facebook, for your questions. And thank you most of all to Abby. So lovely to meet you.